So welcome everyone. We are working with Swami's book on divine friendship, which is really just, surprise, surprise, turning out to be a treasure. We're on the section about Ananda, where we're going to be hanging out for a good bit of time. So let's pray together and then we'll start. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Bless us with your presence in our hearts, your wisdom in our minds, and your love permeating every action and every experience of our lives. We long profoundly and deeply and sincerely to live our lives in accordance with thy will. Guide us and bless us, that in all things we will know that we are acting as you would have us act, drawing ever closer to our divine home. Om. Peace. Amen. So we get to start with Kesava doing a couple of chants for us, a little bit of silence, and then we'll start the book.
Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Deva Maheshwara, Guru Sakshat Param Brahma, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah. Brahmanandam Paramasukadam Kevalam Jnanamurtim Danvatitam Gagana Sadrisham Tattvamasya Didakshiyam Ekam Nityam Vimalam Achalam Sarvade Sakshibhutam Bhavaditam Trigunarahitam Sadgurum Tam Namami. Full of bliss, giving joy, transcendent of higher knowledge, the abode. Do all no more clear as the heavens, known to all as thou art that. He is pure, permanent, unmoving, the everlasting seer of all, far, far beyond qualities and thought. Guru Lord, I bow to thee. Guru Lord, I bow to thee. Tvameva Matai Japita Tvameva, Tvameva Bandhu Jasaka Tvameva, Tvameva vidyam dvaminam dvameva tvameva sarvam mamodeva deva. Thou art my mother, my father, thou art my brother, my friend, thou art my wisdom, my wealth, thou art my all, light of lights art thou. Thou art my mother, my father, thou art my brother, my friend, thou art my wisdom, my wealth, thou art my all, light of lights art thou. Thou art my all, light of lights art thou. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song, listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song, listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song, listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet. Listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song, listen to my soul song, listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet. I will lay them at thy feet. I my Divine Mother, engrossed is the bee of my mind, on the blue lotus feet of my Divine Mother. Divine Mother, my Divine Mother, 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 engrossed is the bee of my mind, on the blue lotus feet of my Divine Mother, engrossed is the bee of my mind, on the blue lotus feet of my Divine Mother. Divine Mother, my Divine Mother, 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 Divine Mother, my Divine Mother.
Let's have a few moments of meditation now, please. Om, peace. Amen. All right, my friends. We are, as I said at the beginning, still on the section called Ananda. And this is a very sort of interesting little piece that we're going to be working with right now. This is from November of 1998. And it's excerpts from a very long piece that Swami wrote at that time, which was called Ananda Directions. And it says it was later placed on the internet. Maybe it's still sitting there, I don't know. I excerpted some of it in my book, Lightbearer. As always, before you to even understand this, well, I mean, the book is published without any context, so I guess you can read the book without context, but that's why we're having a class, is I can give you a lot of context. In 1990, Swami felt that he had done everything he could to create an atmosphere in which there could be a reconciliation between SRF and Ananda. But he felt inwardly guided that the possibility of coming to a harmonious partnership did not seem likely. And he felt that it was time to take a different tact. And that tact, he decided, was to simply do what he felt was appropriate to do, without regard to for trying to always make decisions in the hope that there would be reconciliation. That's how I can put it. He made many, many decisions prior to that time of what he would do and wouldn't do, based on the hope that if he sort of threaded his way carefully, SRF would come to see him and Ananda in a different light. He finally realized that wasn't going to happen. So Ananda had always been Ananda, but there was a nonprofit corporation, religious organization within the middle of Ananda from the start, that had been called the Yoga Fellowship, the Fellowship, and the Fellowship of Intercommunion. I think those were the two legal names. Yoga Fellowship is what Swami usually called it. In 1990, Swamiji decided that the obvious and only name for Master's work had to be self-realization. So he proposed at this January meeting of the Yoga Fellowship. The Yoga Fellowship was kind of like a senior council. You could be a member of Ananda after a year, but you couldn't be a member of the Yoga Fellowship until you had been with Ananda for 5 years and had been voted in by the other members. It was Swami's layer of protection, essentially, and the property was actually owned by the Yoga Fellowship. In Swami's mind, because he was often thinking about SRF, he thought that a day might come when a great many SRF members would move to Ananda, perhaps even after Swami was gone, and the traditions of Ananda would become diluted or even rejected. And so by having the property owned by people who understood and were committed, that was always a protection against an untoward event later on. Swami was very bold, and he was also very practical. He wasn't by any means a wishful thinker. He didn't just do things because he thought if he was really nice, God would cooperate. He was also very, very practical in his idealism. So we always had the Yoga Fellowship. But in 1990, at that January meeting, Swamiji had come to the he felt strong intuitive guidance, because it was a very strong action, that he wanted to change our name to Church of Self-Realization. Ananda Church. Well, it wasn't Ananda Church. It was just Church of Self-Realization. SRF calls it Self-Realization Fellowship Church. That's right. And he wanted to call ours Church of Self-Realization. So we had that meeting. We made that decision, and we went forward to change our name. I talk about it a lot in Light Bearer, so I'm not going to tell you the whole thing. At the same time, Swamiji was writing the next volume of Yogananda's sayings, the next volume, because The Path was the first book he wrote when he was with Master for those 3.5 years, and I've mentioned this elsewhere in this series. Master told him to write down everything that Master said, with the understanding that in time Swami would write books based on all the notes he took about Master. Swami did that very conscientiously, and then after Master died, he collected stories from everyone and reflected on everything he'd ever remembered, and just created a very solid archive of information. He used it to write The Path, and then he finished The Path in 1977, and it wasn't until 1990 that Swami wrote The Essence of Self-Realization. So he started working on The Essence of Self-Realization. I think he had started it before that January meeting. When I was writing the book, I had all my dates exact, but I don't remember in the moment, but it was at the same time. It hadn't yet been published. And claiming the word self-realization as something that Ananda could use instead of being the exclusive property of Self-Realization Fellowship was a very bold act on Swamiji's part, and he had to have been profoundly guided by Master to do it. Even though Swami never spoke of it in those terms, he presented it to us for the inherent logic of it, and said he was not going to hold back anymore, because he didn't feel that was going to ever bring about the result that he wanted. He wanted there to be reconciliation, but he didn't feel holding back was going to attract it. So he was going to try something else. So in January, we changed the name, and in July, SRF filed a massive lawsuit against us based on ownership of the word self-realization and ownership of the name, image, and likeness of Paramahansa Yogananda, and basically every word he ever wrote or spoke. And it was all based on intellectual property and publicity rights to a deceased personality, which is in the trade is called the Bela Lugosi law. Bela Lugosi was a great actor who created the character Dracula. So Dracula, after Bela Lugosi died, especially the way he had presented it, became a very valuable commodity. And there was a great deal of litigation as to who owned the Dracula character created by Bela Lugosi. And so it became accepted precedent for publicity rights to a deceased personality. So essentially we're having a theological dispute with our Guru Bhais over the interpretation of the Master's teachings, which is quite a common and a not unreasonable thing to happen. A Master's teachings are so broad and so individualized that many, many, many expressions are possible. And in the United States, where people can start churches, our Italian friends have found that very difficult to comprehend, because in Europe, of course, especially in Italy, there is the church. And so the idea that you could have lots of churches and that you could just start one if you weren't Jesus Christ was exceedingly confusing to them. But America, God bless America, is this wonderful Dwapara Yuga, anything goes country. So we start churches pretty regularly, and our laws are designed to facilitate the starting of churches. It's very easy. And pretty much anybody can officially become a church. Whether they can get any followers or not is another question, but they can do it from the legal point of view. And in the history of churches in the United States, which is several hundred years old, there is the first church of whatever it is, because it doesn't exist and somebody starts it. I mean, sometimes a church is not a variation on Christianity, but there are a tremendous number of variations on Christianity. Plus, there are churches founded on other bases, like another avatar, like Master. But in the history of churches in America, there's always the first church of whatever it is, the first church of. And in the founding era, the first church of is the only church of. And the first church of invariably believes that it is the true and lasting expression of whatever it's expressing, and that it will. They don't have to call it the first church of, because it's just the church of. And this is the story of the Christian world, because for a long time there was one church. It was the Catholic Church. Well, that's not true. In the West there was the Catholic Church. There was also a church in Russia and Ethiopia and all these other places, but the Catholic Church held it pretty strongly in the Western world. And then, of course, there was the Protestant Reformation. So there was the first church of Jesus' teachings, and then suddenly there was this upstart thing called the Protestant Church. And in Ireland, I think they haven't sorted it out yet. I mean, I haven't followed the news that carefully, but I believe it's still a bit of an issue there, because the first church of thinks it's the only church of. I say this all because this is like, we don't have to get really alarmed about this. This is just what happens. So, Self-Realization Fellowship, founded by Master himself, of course, is the first church of self-realization. There was no other, the word was well known historically in the Eastern traditions, but the Master's church was Master's church. And then what invariably happens is that usually after the founder dies, but not always, but usually after the founder dies, those who are left, somebody either leaves in a huff or is thrown out. And then suddenly you have a problem, because it's always over some theological dispute. So now somebody starts the second church of, and it's a big problem for the first church of, because they have the Orthodox, and this one pretty much by definition is heretical, or else he'd still be part of the first church of. And they almost always were together, and then they split. And the story of Master's work is classic. That's all. Swamiji was prominent, was a leader, was well respected, was with Master. Then 14 years later, well, actually 10 years later, 52, Master died in 52, and in 62, Swami was with them for 14 years, counting the years he was with Master. But 10 years after Master's passing, there was a separation. Not by Swami's choice, but there was a separation. Swami was not supposed to be prominent after that. He was supposed to fade away, but he didn't. And so then suddenly there's this entity called Ananda, and there we are. So in 1990, Swami claimed Master's name, because he said, as disciples, what other name would be appropriate? And now, this is a theological dispute, which is non-justiciable in an American court. American courts are not going to decide who really has the true teachings of the Master, because American courts don't meddle in religious affairs. So the lawsuit that was filed in 1990 was in terms of intellectual property rights, copyright, trademark, and publicity rights to a deceased personality, and name, image, and likeness, all these sorts of things. And there we are. And that went on for 12 years. And in the first few years, all the major issues were lost. They were just lost because America has freedom of religion. And you simply cannot monopolize a teaching. You can own the books that you yourself have edited and published, but you can't own a teaching. It's the way our country works, and it was very, very deliberately established on that basis, that you can't get government support for religious monopoly. So, but the other side genuinely felt, and may still feel, I think the fires have at least banked, if not cooled, by this point. But the founding members who were there at the time couldn't accept that, and felt compelled by God to continue to persevere in preserving their authority and their right to define the Master's work. And unfortunately took a tried and true, tried and untrue technique. Because in America, especially at that period of time, through the 90s, all you have to do with a religious leader is accuse them of impropriety, especially sexual impropriety. Financial impropriety doesn't hurt, but sexual is really the big one. And you couldn't destroy them in the newspaper. And that was in the 90s. Now you can destroy them with a Twitter. And I'm not making light of genuine abuse, but I also have had a lot of firsthand experience about how well-meaning people who are trying to right historic wrongs can be easily misguided. So the end of all of this is that there was one avenue left, and that was called tarnishment, which is if association in the mind of the public between you as a plaintiff and them as a defendant, if their reputation is so tarnished that your reputation is tarnished by association, then you may win back certain monopolistic. It gives you another opportunity to restore a monopoly. So that's what happened. 1994, there was a second litigation that started, and it was entirely, I don't actually know what it was actually called, but commonly you would call it sexual harassment. It was not based on fact, truth, or anything. And one of the problems that we had with that one was it was so preposterous. We couldn't take it seriously. We didn't take it seriously. We really thought, this is ridiculous, it'll never get traction. But we were naive. And we didn't get the right lawyer, and we didn't get a very good judge. So in February, November, December, January, maybe into February of 97 and 98, we had a trial, big media experience, big event, very big event. And in the end, we were judged, the phrase I usually use is morally reprehensible. And it was judicial error. It was rife with judicial error, but when you appeal and you win, all you get is that you get a new trial. We couldn't afford it financially, and we couldn't afford it emotionally. We were done. It just didn't matter to us. We knew we were condemning ourselves to tremendous misunderstanding, which continues to this day. But we knew that our opponents had unlimited appetite to destroy us by whatever means were available to them. And we didn't have it to defend ourselves. So we walked away. As soon as that trial was over, and this was a very long introduction, but I never know how to tell this any shorter. As soon as that trial was over, Swami left for Europe, and he didn't come back to America for 2 years. And I mean, we didn't know if he'd ever come back. I mean, he was just going to wipe the dust of America off his feet and go someplace else. So he went to live in Italy. He went to live, he actually got his own little house near the Ananda Center, quite near, but not in the Ananda Center. So, and it was at the end of a dirt road, and Narya and Laura had their own home at the front of that road. It wasn't dirt, but a quiet road. They had their house at the corner of that road. So basically, you know, it was very, very protected. And then Swami had this wonderful little house, which is where he also died, in that house, in an open field with no one around him. And he also felt that all of this was about Divine Mother wanting him to become completely free to do whatever she wanted him to do. And as he put it, Ananda is an important part of the work that Master gave me to do, but is by no means the definition of it. And he felt if he stayed at Ananda Village, which at that time he only had the 2 houses, at the end he had a 3rd home in India. If he stayed at Ananda Village, interestingly, his house at Ananda Village was an apartment in what was really a community center, Crystal Hermitage. So the Crystal Hermitage, even though his apartment was absolutely silent, and you could have literally 150 people in the garden or in the house upstairs, and Swami's house was still completely quiet, and there was no visual disturbance even. But he could feel the energy, and there was all of Ananda around him. And he said he actually needed to be free even of the thought form of Ananda, so that he could just move on without being limited by what he'd already accomplished. You know, that's the bane of many people, is that they have one success, and then that success, they just keep riding on that success instead of doing following ever new inspiration. Swami knew that that was not for him, and he just really wanted to be somewhere else. It was a most unpleasant experience for those years. Going on with that, so in 1998, which is when he was in there, he moved, this was written in November of 98, and he moved at the beginning of the year. He was doing a tremendous amount of reflecting on Ananda itself, on our future, on who we should be and what we should do, how we should organize. He also had in front of him a salutary, if that's the right word, salutary example of the possible directions a religious organization can go. And he was not inspired by it. And he was, and all through his life, he was exceedingly keen on using the example of that branch of Master's work to show us what an institutional model can look like, especially at that time. And he really wanted to build Ananda in another way. So all of that is, he wrote this very long letter called Ananda's Directions. And there was a lot in there. I mean, it was many pages. And what's been done here is some interesting paragraphs have been pulled out of it. But I realized as I was reviewing it before we started, it's not as if those paragraphs were actually together in the brochure. So each one almost just has to stand on its own. And unlike other letters in this book, this was not written to a person. This was not some soul who appealed to Swamiji for something that they, you know, was upsetting their heart and needed guidance on. This was Swami himself setting a direction for all of Ananda, with a view not only to the present but to the future. And he was writing to individuals, to people, but he was not writing to individuals. So the whole tone of it is different. I'm saying all of that because when I myself read it, I was first a little confused. I know this document well, but I didn't bother to compare it. I'm just going to, now, having said all of that, let's start. And it, it just starts in a place without it starts with a non sequitur, because it is the middle of a sentence. It's the middle of a conversation that we're reading here. So, dear ones, it says, I think we all feel the need for decentralizing Ananda. I don't know if we all feel the need for it, but I think it was in contrast to what we'd just been through, where we could see what happens if you centralize way too much. And also Ananda itself was at a turning point. Let me think where we were in 98. Yeah, during the same time that we were in all that litigation is when all of our urban centers were founded. So it was on one hand, the most extraordinarily expensive, $1 million a year, $13 million of legal expenses, plus all of our communities were started at that period of time. So it was the most stressful and the most expansive and extraordinary period of Ananda's history. Odd, isn't it? So here we are. I think we all feel the need for decentralizing Ananda. The thought has occurred to me that in the past, when the development of a spiritual work has been determined by one disciple alone, the scope of the Guru's teaching has become narrowed. No one disciple can embrace in its totality what the Guru taught, unless he himself is as great as the Guru. So that was a very direct reference to the fact that the model followed, by the Catholic Church, let's start there, but also by the First Church of Self-Realization, was very much a Catholic model, that the president of that organization is, and this is literally was, I haven't followed them in the last decade, the president of that organization is the sole authorized representative of Paramahansa Yogananda, and that all authority stems from that individual. And therefore, what that individual perceives to be the Master's will is the Master's will. And that's the model of the Pope, that in the Catholic Church, everything traces back to Peter. When Jesus said to Peter, thou art Peter, which means rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. Now, Master explains that to mean he meant the church of inner realization. But the institution of the Catholic Church interpreted that to mean that Jesus foresaw this edifice, this creation, this institutional creation, and that every pope gets his authority directly from Peter. As Swami says, they conveniently overlook the periods of time when there were several popes competing for that role, but nonetheless, it's a direct lineage. Jesus empowered Peter. Peter has empowered everyone after that, and that's exactly the model that was presented. And Swami's just answering it directly. If you take the work of an avatar and allow one disciple to say what is and isn't true, then you have reduced that avatar's teaching down to what that one disciple is capable of understanding, or even on a much more mundane level, is interested in. When Swami spoke to the president of the First Church when he was still part of that organization, and he said, when are we going to start the communities that Master so earnestly wanted to start? She replied, frankly, I'm not interested. Well, she had a right to be not interested. It's impossible even to imagine that one person could embrace all the potentiality of an avatar's teaching. But the fact that a person is not interested does not mean that it should not be done. And, this is precisely what Swamiji, this is the bane of organizations, is that they narrow down to what a handful of people can imagine is appropriate. Not because those are the only possibilities, but they're the only possibilities they feel that they can do. And an enormous amount is lost. I mean, spiritually speaking, it's not sensible, which is why in India they have had an entirely different way of doing it. Every disciple has not only the right, but the responsibility to draw into himself or herself as much as they can of the Guru's inspiration and then express it as they feel the Master wants to express it through them. That's the essential conflict. That's what the entire lawsuit was about, which is that does authority pass directly and only through the institutionally mandated channels, or can any disciple pick up the inspiration of the Guru and carry it forth in their own way? So this is why Swami says, I think we all agree that we need to decentralize. And he's not just talking about, who orders the towels or something like that. He's talking about that spiritual authority cannot be concentrated solely in the hands of one disciple, not even himself. However, and there's other conditioning factors, but decentralization, which Swami has actually set up magnificently, has allowed just a wide variety of interpretations. And as we go through this letter, you'll see that Swami balances it on both sides. So then he says, when I say of Ananda that I think we should concentrate on decentralizing it, I mean first that it seems to me our colonies need greater autonomy. Actually, the control exercised from Ananda village has always been benign. With increasing centralization, however, that control might cease to be perceived as such by other colonies. We use the word colonies at that point. More recently, we've been calling them communities. There's been reasons why. Colony, for one, has a kind of a bad rap now because white man's privilege was found in colonies in other places, and so colonies has become associated with a degree of racism, which is impossibly inappropriate for us. And also in India, they call an apartment complex a colony. It's just the way they use. If you live in these gated communities where you have many hundreds of residents, often in multiple buildings, but they'll call it a colony. So once you become international, the meaning of words becomes a little bit more difficult. The word church doesn't really work that well in India. The word minister doesn't work that well in Europe, because in Europe, a minister is a government official. And so it's, there's just, you have to think about these things once you're out of your own home country. My original idea was for our branch communities to be autonomous. As colonies actually developed, however, it became clear that no one who was qualified to found them would want to be separated from our spiritual home at Ananda village. When he said autonomous, he really meant like wholly independent, just simply, the inspiration of whoever was founding them, and they would be their own entities. Swamiji was so averse to centralizing authority that he was always thinking about this from the very beginning. He saw it even as a young man growing up. His father worked for what was then called Standard Oil, which later became Esso. And now this was in the, Swami was born in 1926, and his father was well established in that career, so it was a wholly different era than this one. But his father was an oil geologist, and he worked in Romania. He started working in Mexico and Romania. He worked in Egypt. He worked in France. And his father was subjected to the experience of some bloke from the home office, which was New York City, just coming out to the field, and his father told Swami, just this exasperating experience of this man just walking into the territory that Mr. Walters had been working for years and saying, dig there, just because he was from the home office and he could say that. But he didn't know anything about what he was doing. And it was just a power play, pure and simple. And Swamiji was profoundly conscious of human nature and profoundly conscious of the limitations and foibles of human nature. And he wanted to organize in such a way, no one can be completely protected, but he wanted to try to keep the spirit. He wanted to keep the spirit alive. And giving strong, creative people the opportunity to do it their way, to keep decision making as close to the grassroots level as possible, and to reward initiative rather than punish it. There was something that happened, it would have been in the early 80s. There was this man in one of our, up in the Northwest area. He was an unusual man. He had many very fine qualities and some profound eccentricities. And we had no, let me think about it for a moment. I guess we had the house in San Francisco, we had the house in Sacramento, and we had Ocean Song, which was a community in near Sebastopol that we had for 7 years. But the property was to be donated, and the owner could never bring himself to donate it. And when it became obvious that he was never going to give it up, we just folded up our tent and gave it up ourselves. But so there was a lot going on. But then this effort was starting up more along the West Coast. And my job during the early 80s for about 5 years was I traveled a lot. I was a circuit preacher for Ananda, and I went that way. So there was this man, and he was quite charismatic, very industrious, very creative, and he drew together a group of about 30-some people who were very dedicated to Master. And I visited regularly and just sort of helped get that group started. But he was eccentric. He had his own ideas about things. And he eventually incorporated, as an Ananda entity, using Ananda's name, Ananda's everything except that he made himself spiritual director for life. And there was a big kerfuffle about that. And I was way beyond my pay grade in trying to figure out what to do, because this was all brand new territory. None of us knew anything about this, and I was 35. I mean, I'd been in Ananda for more than a decade, but I was really just getting my sea legs in all of this too. And so I invited this man to come to Ananda Village and to meet Swami Kriyananda, and Swami would straighten it out. So he came, and he was very dynamic, and I was there and a few others. We had a long, very interesting conversation, and they talked all about what he was doing and why he was doing and so on like this. And Swami listened very respectfully and attentively, and raised certain serious issues of discipleship, of attunement, of various things like this, but he didn't really argue it in any way. He just raised different points of view. And toward the end, Swami finally said, essentially, inasmuch as I am the spiritual director for life of Ananda, if you wish to be the spiritual director for life, maybe you should use a name other than Ananda. And that was basically the only direct instruction he gave to him. And so the man left, and he went back to his home, and he changed the name. He kept his role, but he changed the name, that was fine. That was what he could do. But here, and after saying all that, here's the interesting part. I was there with Swami, and after the man left, and it'd all been very cordial, and he left the house, Swami said to me and to the others who were there, he said, I'd much rather, let's see, how did he put it? Anyone with spunk will just go ahead and do something. They won't sit and wait for the head office to tell them what to do. He said, I'd much rather have a man like that working for Ananda. And I mean, it was a very interesting statement. He was not at all concerned about the man's many outrageous points of view. Outrageous from the quote, orthodoxy of what we were doing, even to the point of appointing himself to Swami's role. Swami said, anybody with spunk is going to just move ahead. And the people who don't have the imagination or the courage to move ahead will never build Ananda in the way Swami really envisioned it being built. So Swami's primary goal was to give space where people could do meaningful work, and they could do it from their own inspiration and not just as, in line like this. It's more convenient if everybody stays in line, but the product is not necessarily what you want. Swami said when he took over the monks from Master, when Master asked Swami to be in charge of the monastery, Swami said you would have thought Master would have sat down and told him what he wanted to have done. But he said Master rarely gave him any instructions. If Swami was really going off the rails, Master would push him back a little bit. But Swami realized much later that Master was constantly inspiring him from the inside. And I believe last week I talked about this. How Swami would project ideas to those who were in tune. And then we would receive those ideas. But they would feel natural to our own temperament, because those are the ideas, one, that Swami would project, but two, those are the ones we could receive. And then we would make them our own. It's a subtle aspect of discipleship that when you live it, you understand it. You understand how the inspiration of the Master and the disciple become the same reality. And it's not like you're being run, and it's not like you're running yourself. You're in tune. And so therefore you naturally sing the same melodies, because you're all trying to make the same choir in a sense. But decentralization is very important for that to work, because there has to be this feeling of freedom and independent initiative. So going back to it, so my idea was for the branch communities to be autonomous, but as they actually developed, it became clear that no one who was qualified to found one would want to be separated from the spiritual whole. Thus I proposed that those early branch communities, at least, be thought of as a single spiritual family. In this way, people could be shifted about between them according to their own and the colony's needs. I remember asking Swami, because I'm very independent, and I like to do things my way, and Swamiji worked with me always very with a great awareness of where my energy would naturally flow and where it would not work very harmoniously. But I sort of asked him the question, why does it matter, sir? Oh, I knew what happened. Someone said to me that they thought after Swami passed that the different aspects of Ananda would sort of break apart, become independent. And I mentioned that to Swami. He said, I would be very sad to see that happen. And I actually asked him sincerely, why does it matter? His answer was brilliant, really. He said, for one reason, he said, is that if an individual found something that is only their entity and they're solely responsible for it, he said they're trapped in it for the rest of their lives. And if their karma changes or the needs of their spiritual life change and something else would be more suitable for them, they can't. They can't make a shift because everything depends on them. He said if Ananda is interrelated and we're always shifting, among ourselves, he said then every individual can continually find that area of service that is going to be the most expansive for them. And over the years, I've vividly remembered that, and he's absolutely correct. It makes the doorway of opportunity so much wider, and the capacity to adjust to life changes in relationship, changes in family status, changes in health, changes in abilities, with it that either manifest or decline as time passes. And with thinking of all of the communities as interrelated, at least, if not interlocked, then all of a sudden all of these options are available. Nowadays one can change countries, what to speak of changing communities. So there are many other reasons that you might argue, but in many ways that's the most dynamic. That incorporates both the benefits of autonomy and the benefits of unity. I don't know if there's any letters in here, because shortly after this is November of 1998, and in spring of 1999, Swami called all the colony leaders to where he was living in Assisi, and we spent 2 weeks, which was a long time. I believe it was 2 weeks. Meeting every day, for hours every day, just going through every possible issue. And we, at that time, also developed, Hriman in Seattle deserves credit for this. He just developed a brilliant legal structure for us. And partly we'd been really, we escaped disaster, but we were on the edge of disaster during that litigation, because Even though we were legally autonomous, there were interlocking boards, board of directors, which is it's complicated, but we managed to skate through. For a period of time, it looked like every asset of Ananda globally was going to be subject to this litigation, but we managed to get out of that. So we then had a huge incentive to decentralize legally. We were already decentralized legally, but because basically what it was, Swamiji had to reach through every board of directors. And that became very dicey legally. It was one of the few things that terrible judge saw correctly. It was like Divine Mother, took us to the edge of that cliff and then pulled us back. But, and that was one of the reasons we couldn't appeal and go forward, is because they were already adjusting to that and beginning to sweep all of us into litigation. And it just wasn't, we couldn't do it. But anyway, just because I brought it up, Preman developed this reality where there is no legally binding. We became very sophisticated. There was no interlocking board. There was no reach-through, a legal reach-through that Kriyananda had. We are united by the Sevaka monastic order. And the Sevaka monastic order is, I think what they call it is corporation soul, which you would love to be S-O-U-L, but I think it's S-O-L-E, which means that the corporation has one member, one board, one director, one member, who is the spiritual director of Ananda, which at the present is Jyotish. I think I have this close to accurate. In any case, and all of our bylaws reference our relationship to the monastic order, and the monastic order has a tiny legal footprint, just a tiny legal footprint. And all of our interrelationship is based on our spiritual affinity. So it actually really says it. It says what's true. And then there's a little bit of very well conceived authority that kind of gradually rests on the senior members. Not senior like you have to be there 50 years, but Sevaka life members and light bearers, ministers. So there's more authority, but that authority is also balanced with the necessity to have certain ideas ratified by the Sevaka order. So it's absolutely brilliant. It was a divine inspiration from the start. So Swami wrote this in November, and then a few months later he called us there, and then we sort of, having integrated all of these ideas, we began to figure out what to do and how to do it. One, because we realized what a litigious society we were living in, and we had really experienced litigation as a weapon of persecution, and we needed to be smart, not frightened, but smart. Whereas prior to that, there's another letter actually in a few pages here about the effect of the lawsuits on us, so I won't go any more with that. Okay. So he said, thus I propose that those early branch communities at least be thought of as a single spiritual family. In this way, people could be shifted about. That's what he wrote. When Swami was here, we really shifted about a lot. It's one of the, none of us quite know how to replace that. Swami would just, he considered the work as a whole, globally. And if something was needed in some other place, he would, and it was good for you. You could get a call in the morning and you'd be packed up and going somewhere else by the evening. And, Swami wasn't careless about it. And he wasn't inconsiderate, but sometimes, one would be deprived because the other grade was neater, the other need was greater, or Swami sensed that this person really needed this change. Now we have to work without that, sudden shifting that Swami would provide. And of course we're managing nicely, but life is different without him. There is a danger in centralization, however, of creeping institutionalism and impose uniformity that does not and cannot take into account the special circumstances faced by individuals in branch communities. Our real bond in any case is the love and divine friendship we feel for one another, and not our institutional structure. Our soul bonds don't depend for their strength on centralized control and might become frayed where centralized control exercised too rigidly. Swami is such a wordsmith. You know, our bonds might become frayed. That's such a gentle word. Our bonds might become frayed where centralized control exercised too rigidly. And earlier, Swami says, you know, control is exercised with the light hand, but as time passes, will it always be? If you set up a structure in which it could be exercised with a more rigid hand, human nature is such that such a temptation is likely to arise and to be responded to. Because it's just easier to run things if you have rules. It's easier to run things if you can tell people how they're supposed to be. And then it's a wild ride, because then you begin to attract people who like that. And I don't mean that to be in any way insulting or demeaning. It's different temperaments. I actually have, when I was living in the monastery at Ananda, which was my first 10 years, it was so, what's the word I want to use? Well, we had to take so much personal responsibility. And I would often think, you know, about the joy of an orderly monastic life. You know, where, and I thought sometimes, you know, if I joined one of these cloistered orders or one of these Catholic orders, I was thinking, you know, just romantically, I'm Jewish, for heaven's sakes, I don't know anything about them except what I've read in books. And none of that was modern, all of that was old saints. But I would be able to predict exactly where I would be on exactly this day, 25 or 30 years in the future. And I actually used to meditate on whether I would die from that or whether I would really love it. I was just thinking of the extraordinary freedom that gives you from so many things that occupy our time and energy. One of the things that happens when I go into seclusion, I'm sure it happens when other people go into seclusion too, but I'll speak for myself, and reality just narrows. I just realize how much time and energy is spent just living. I live in this house, which in normal times is a community house. Otherwise, it's a 3-bedroom home. It's much too large for me. I share it full-time with Keshava at this point. But in normal times, it's not only the residence with constant guests, constant activities, but it's a big place. This isn't, you know, it's not my inclination. I think I've managed a lot of homes in many incarnations, and it doesn't thrill me. But sometimes I'm just like, oh my God, there's just so much to do, and at the end of it, you've done nothing. You've just moved all the paces around one more day. It's just amazing to me how it just all stacks up. And then you go into seclusion and everything gets so simple. Just so simple. So I would multiply that by a monastic life and think, that could be really great. But the other side of it is, you know, your relationships can fray if there's too much centralized control. So let's go on. So he says, from our very beginning, I have adhered to the advice Master gave me when I was organizing the monks. Don't make too many rules, Master said. It destroys the spirit. That's really important. It's another one of those Ananda dictums that have guaranteed our success. Don't make too many rules, that it destroys the spirit. People then can't behave according to their own inspiration, or they look to see what they're supposed to do instead of looking into their hearts to feel what they feel to do. Of course, it has a benefit, an obvious benefit, but it also has a potential terrible downside. Thus, I have allowed decision-making to take place as much as possible at a grassroots level, and have tried rather to nudge things along in the direction, the spirit primarily, that Master would want them to go in, rather than insist that everything be done in specific ways. Nudge things along in the way that Master would prefer, is how Swami puts it. This appearance of laissez-faire has been our strength, not our weakness, for it has developed people to the point where they've understood for themselves what is the best course to follow. That's what I was saying, the difficulty of having things too clear-cut and your path laid out before you is that you follow it out of respect for it and out of faith that if I follow it, it will bring me what I want. But the understanding has come from the outside, not from a spontaneous realization of the rightness of it. Now, both things can happen, but there's a danger. And there's a danger that a person will never be forced to face their own true reality. Because if it's too laid out and I can just fit into it, I might not even know. But if it's laissez-faire and any road is open to you, then the roads you choose have to be really your own roads. You have to make a real decision. And of course, I've loved that. Naturally, there has had to be a degree of guidance also, or else everything would have ended in chaos. And of course, earlier in this book, we were talking about some of those early years. But the guidance itself has had to take into account where people were in their own understanding and their readiness for whatever step needed to be taken. The contribution of individual insights, moreover, has ensured an all-round development overall for Ananda, because individuals are encouraged to have ideas and to express them. It is generally understood now that the wisdom in Master's teachings resides primarily in those who have been disciples for many years. Still, it is also wholesome for people to have the freedom to make most of their own decisions, for in this way they develop wisdom themselves to guide Ananda in the future in the direction it should take. I believe a lot of this paper was also about Swami's role. I don't think any of that is included in this book. But this long conversation about centralizing and authority and freedom and what is good and what is bad was also part of this bigger discussion, which is where does Swami fit in? Because he felt at that critical juncture of Ananda life that we really needed to understand that we were an expression of him as a direct disciple, of the inspiration that flowed through him as a direct disciple. Then this is how it could manifest, but that inspiration from him as a direct disciple couldn't be considered dispensable. Because the entire effort, especially of the second lawsuit, was to discredit him as a disciple. And Swami felt that that would be the end of Ananda. And that was not a self-evident truth to everyone. So that's what a lot of that was about. So that was that section, for whatever it was. Then here's another excerpt from the letter, the same letter, and it's an interesting one. It's about religious sectarianism. So again, this sort of comes this is a non sequitur, but another example Swamiji felt of institutionalism taking over a religious work to its detriment was the Ramakrishna order. Ramakrishna was an avatar who died at the end of the 1800s. He died pretty much just as Master was born, right around the same time. And Ramakrishna, very famous in India with good cause. My first introduction to self-realization was through Ramakrishna and his disciple Vivekananda, through their writings and their consciousness. I was born obviously too late. And Ramakrishna brought the Dwapara Yuga message that all spiritual paths lead to the same goal, that the truth is one and the paths are many, and that all paths are equal. And Ramakrishna himself was exceedingly eccentric character. And one of the ways that he demonstrated the oneness of all faiths was that periodically he would practice different ones. And he became Christian for a time. He became Radha devoted. He became Radha devoted to Krishna for a time. He became Hanuman devoted to Rama for a time. And he just demonstrated that any practice can lead to God realization. And he was very devotional and very free. He lived at this temple, this Kali temple, outside of Calcutta at Dakshineshwar. And he was a great worshiper of Divine Mother, of Mother Kali, and just full of devotion and spontaneous worship. So now Swami writes, Sri Ramakrishna's legacy was squeezed into a box. Again, these are not letters to any individual. That's why they sound more like essays, because that's what it is. Sri Ramakrishna's legacy was squeezed into a box of ultra-sectarianism by his disciples, and even more so by their successors. Our Guru commented to me, Sri Ramakrishna would have turned over in his grave to see what they've done to his teachings. It's a pretty strong statement. Had the disciples been free to develop their own understanding of their Guru's teachings, perhaps in their very variety, they would have given a more complete picture of what their Guru had taught. Master Mahashaya, known as M to the readers of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, and known as the blissful devotee in the autobiography of a yogi, because there's a whole chapter devoted to Master Mahashaya, had such freedom. Would that they'd all had it, for then the Ramakrishna order might have been spared its later developments. Because that order was formed entirely by Swami Vivekananda, who was considered to be one of the foremost disciples, but Ramakrishna had many highly evolved devotees because he was an avatar. It became defined by his vision, which, lofty though it certainly was, focused on the need in India for social uplift. Now, I'm not going to be able to finish this tonight, and here's a spoiler alert. The letter after this one is Swami apologizing for what he wrote about the Ramakrishna order, because this whole Ananda Directions letter ended up getting posted on the internet, and disciples of Ramakrishna were, Swami felt, rightly offended by what he'd written. That Swami hadn't really, he'd approved the wide dissemination of this. He'd written it originally for the family, but that was a pretty big group anyway. But once it got on the internet, it got into their hands. So Master did say that, and Swami's point of view about the sectarianism that developed in the Ramakrishna order after the Guru's passing was true, but Swami in the next letter apologizes because he said Master wouldn't have wanted me to say that. But it's still true, and it's interesting. And see, the point is, and this is the point Swami felt was important, that's why he included it, is that the definition of the order fell into the hands of one disciple. For many reasons, all in God's plan, but Vivekananda became the one who defined how they were going to go forward. And that was what Swami was most concerned about. Now bear in mind, all of this is written in the context of Swami asserting his own authority and position more than he had ever done before. It was right at this time he asserted it more than he'd ever done it before. But he wanted it understood in context, and that's why he said this. So the point was, because that order was formed entirely by Swami Vivekananda, it became defined by his vision, which was very oriented toward social uplift. The Ramakrishna order really began, whereas the primary monastic tradition, often at that time, was the sadhu seeking God. Ramakrishna involved the order in helping to change India, to take care of the poor and to do charity work and so on. Thus, the Guru's message was stripped of the beautiful spontaneity, informality, and devotion that were so shiningly present in Ramakrishna's own life. Instead, his legacy was preempted by the scholarly intellectuals who evolved from the Vedantic emphasis Swami Vivekananda gave those teachings in his efforts to make his Guru's vision acceptable to the West. Vivekananda went to England, and he went to America, and he founded the Ramakrishna Mission in America. And Swami Ramtirtha came to America earlier. Swami Vivekananda came to America, and Master came after that. Vivekananda only stayed for a few years, but he planted his Ramakrishna missions around America, and he brought his Gurubhais, his fellow monks from India, and he planted them in those missions. And I myself benefited enormously. My spiritual life was formed in the temples that he started. So endless gratitude. However, he was also thinking then, that this worship of Kali was never going to magnetize people to these teachings. So he did take a very Vedantic approach. And it was his writings that got me onto the path. So it all worked, but Swami wanted us to use it as a salutary example of what can happen if one disciple is allowed to define the whole work. That was Swami's concern here. I'm reminded of something Master once said to Dayamata: "How you all will change the work after I'm gone. I just wonder if I were to return here 100 years from now, whether I'd even recognize it." Now, their response to that concern was to become very focused on making sure everything stayed exactly as it was supposed to stay, which was ironic, because that very effort to make a rule and make sure that this is the only thing that was acceptable because this is how Master did it, was the very thing that caused it to institutionalize rather than to remain free as Master had made it, which is where he says, he's speaking of Ramakrishna, the beautiful spontaneity, informality, and devotion. It's all, this is why it takes us so long to get liberated. And this is why at a certain point in a person's spiritual development, they'll just walk away from institutions altogether. When Swami was visiting Yogi Ramya, who Master met in India, he was a disciple of Ramana Maharshi, and Master said he was a fully realized being. And Swami spent 4 days with him. He lived completely by himself in this little hut in a small village. He had only a handful of disciples. He did no notable work. Swami said to him, let's see, how did he put it? What would have been the question? Let me just think for a moment. Basically, with all the realization you have, shouldn't you be doing more for the world, for devotees? And the yogi replied, God has done what he's wanted to do through this body. And Swami realized that your work in the world is not the definition of God's will. That's why Swami says to speak of a great master is a bit odd because all masters are equal. But he said the greatness can be in the mission that they're given to do. Master was given a great mission. Yogi Ramya was given equal realization. Master said about him, if I had spent another half an hour in his company, I could never have brought myself to leave India again. Master met him in 1935. So Swami said that. And then Swami was talking to Yogi Ramya about Dayamata and about her position. And the yogi asked Swamiji, what is she responsible for? And Swami described her duties as the president of SRF. And the yogi said, oh, what a burden, like this. And so Swami then teasingly, but also seriously said, So then it's her bad karma. It's only because she has very bad karma that she has to be president of the organization. So the guru punished her by making her the president. And the yogi laughed and he said, no. He said, for her, it's her path to realization. But his first response was, oh, what a burden. And the worldly man thinks, oh, look, she's adored by many. She's taken care of by all these people. She's so well thought of. She's lives in a lovely place, she's admired, just everybody listens to her. And all the yogi could think is, oh, what a burden. Because informality, spontaneity, devotion, this is just the way it all works. So, perhaps though, looking back at Sri Ramakrishna's legacy, it needed the focus of Vivekananda, that Vivekananda gave it, in order to survive as a coherent tradition. I don't know. All I can do is add that, if such be the case, what survived was something rather different from Ramakrishna's spirit. His spiritual descendants today claim that since Ramakrishna was the first master to demonstrate the truth that all paths lead to the same goal, he was therefore the greatest of all those masters. The Ramakrishna mission has even campaigned, as I understand, with what success I don't know, to be recognized as a new religion. How ironic, considering that their master's mission was to demonstrate the basic oneness of all religions. And these are the reasons why Swami feels this way. Sri Ramakrishna's place in history is assured, above all, by the example of his own beautiful life. Everything his successors have accomplished, though done in his name, may be considered a footnote. That's an interesting way. Paramahansa Yogananda's vision, similarly, is being placed in an institutional straitjacket. So this is the reason why Swami is saying all of this, because Master himself, this is the entire reason why Swami did this, you have to understand, because Master himself spoke this way about what had happened to that institution. Master says, Ramakrishna would be appalled. And Swami sees the danger of that exact same thing happening to Master's teaching. So whenever Swami would write like this, he was writing to us at Ananda, but everything that happened at Ananda eventually got into the hands of the leadership of SRF. And so Swami was constantly also talking to them. So this is why he wrote like this. Swami Master's vision is also being placed in an institutional straitjacket. Perhaps the narrow interpretation that is being given his teachings by SRF is needed in the sense that a focused may have been needed also in order to keep Ramakrishna's contribution to the world vital and strong. As in that case, however, the consequence has been a loss for the world. In SRF's case, vital and strong doesn't mean inspiring and wise. Though the SRF leaders are dedicated to the organization he founded, the universality of Master's teachings is being ever increasingly enchained by sectarianism. What an irony. Universality was the very thing that gave Yogananda's teachings their greatest beauty and inspiration. Swamiji felt it necessary to the very end of his life to constantly point out the potential of certain decisions and certain directions once they are set in place. My experience, and I have only a minute here, my experience through 12 years of litigation, and in a very weird way, I probably spent more time with some of the now deceased direct disciples of Master than many people who are deeply devoted to them. Always in terrible circumstances, in courtrooms and meeting rooms and so on. But they're wonderful people, of course they are. Extraordinary people. Came young, gave their whole lives to their guru, and never wavered from that, never veered from that. I don't know them well enough to know what internal victories they had to win, but they never veered. And I think they ended up where they ended up, where they were litigating against us for all those years. They got there a quarter of an inch at a time, probably even less than that. You make one small decision, then you have to support it with another one, then you have to support it with another one, then you have to support it with another one. That's what Swami wanted to warn us about. Don't make that first decision. Don't ever feel that you have to compromise in this way, because you don't. And so he wanted us to really understand, using Ramakrishna, using also what had happened with the first church of, that we don't have to go there. We have a complete alternative. And then he would analyze. See, what Swami would always do for us, he didn't tell us what we had to do. He explained to us what all the reasonings were behind the suggestions he was making. So we wouldn't just know how to behave, we would know how to think. Because life is full of unexpected things. And you can't always have a rule, because it may not be anticipated. But if you know how to think, and you know what the principles are, and you know how to see how they apply, then you always at least have a good chance of staying on the right road and arriving at the right goal. So, God bless you, my friends.